Before we dive into this forgotten story from the Eastern Front, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. The snow had stopped falling somewhere around midnight, leaving behind a silence so complete that Obergefreiter Klaus Hoffmann could hear his own heartbeat echoing inside the cramped fighting compartment of the Panzer IV. He sat wedged between cold steel and leather padding, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated against the breech of the 75mm gun. The interior smelled of gun oil, unwashed bodies, and the acrid residue of burned propellant that no amount of ventilation could ever fully clear. Outside, through the narrow vision slit, the landscape of western Ukraine stretched endlessly, a monochrome canvas of white fields interrupted by skeletal trees and the occasional burned-out farmhouse, its black scars against pristine snow. It was February 1945, and the Third Reich was dying, though no one in Hoffmann's crew spoke those words aloud. They had retreated across half of Europe, leaving behind the smoking ruins of panzer divisions that once rolled toward Moscow with unstoppable momentum. Now they fought a different war, one of desperate counterattacks and hasty withdrawals. Always outnumbered, always watching the horizon for the next wave of Soviet armor. Hoffmann adjusted his position, trying to find comfort where none existed. At 23, he had been at war for 4 years, though it felt like a lifetime. He remembered his mother's face as she waved goodbye at the Berlin train station, pride and terror competing in her eyes. That memory seemed to belong to a different person now, someone who believed in clean uniforms and parade ground glory. The reality was this: freezing metal, constant fear, and the knowledge that every day you survived was borrowed time. Movement, 11 o'clock, came the voice of Lieutenant Weber, their commander, from the turret above. His tone carried the practiced calm of a man who had learned to mask panic with procedure. Hoffmann pressed his eye to the gunner's sight, scanning the tree line where Weber had indicated. For long seconds he saw nothing but snow and shadow. Then there a flicker of movement, low and dark against the white. His stomach tightened. "I see it, Herr Lieutenant. Tank, possibly T-34. Range approximately 1,000 meters." Inside the Panzer, the crew shifted into practice motion. Dietrich, the loader, pulled a shell from the ready rack, the metal scraping against metal in the confined space. Muller, the driver, kept the engine idling low, ready to maneuver on command. Weber worked the turret controls, bringing the gun to bear. They had done this dance dozens of times, but familiarity never erased the fear. Each engagement could be your last. "More of them," Weber announced. "Ivan's bringing friends to the party," through the sight. Hoffmann watched as 3, then 4, then 6 Soviet tanks emerged from the forest. T-34s, their sloped armor distinctive even at distance. They moved with the confidence of hunters who knew their prey was cornered. The Germans were part of a screening force, holding a village crossroads that High Command deemed strategically vital. Though Hoffmann suspected it was vital only because some general couldn't admit there was nowhere left to retreat to. "Orders, Herr Lieutenant?" Hoffmann asked, though he already knew the answer. They would fight, because that's what they did. The alternative surrender meant a Soviet prison camp, and stories from the East promised that such places were antechambers to hell. "We wait until they're closer," Weber said. "Let them think the position is clear. Then we hit them hard and fast." The minutes crawled past. Hoffmann watched the Soviet tanks advance, buttoned up and cautious, spreading out in a textbook assault formation. Whoever commanded that unit knew their business. The T-34s moved in coordinated bounds, always keeping some tanks stationary to provide covering fire while others advanced. Professional work. The propaganda posters back home showed Soviet soldiers as barely human Asiatic hordes. But the men in those tanks were soldiers, well-trained and increasingly well-equipped. "Range 800 meters, Hoffmann reported. His hand rested on the firing mechanism, palms sweating despite the cold. 750. 700, steady, Weber said. "Wait for my command." At 600 meters, Weber gave the order. "Fire." Hoffmann squeezed the trigger. The Panzer IV rocked backward as the gun fired, the blast deafening in the enclosed space even through their headsets. Through the acrid smoke, Hoffmann watched the tracer arc toward the lead T-34. The shot struck low, deflecting off the sloped glacis plate in a shower of sparks. The Soviet tank jerked to a halt. "Reload," Weber shouted. "Traverse right, next target." Dietrich slammed another shell into the breach. The turret winced as it rotated. Around them, other German tanks opened fire from concealed positions around the village. The crossroads erupted into chaos. Soviet tanks returned fire, their 76mm guns cracking like thunder. A Panzer 350 meters to their left took a direct hit, flames erupting from its engine compartment. For the next 20 minutes, Hoffmann existed in a fugue state where time became elastic and meaningless. Load, aim, fire, repeat. The gunner's sight became his entire universe, a circle of magnified horror where metal met metal and men died unseen. His crew's Panzer took 2 hits, one bouncing off the frontal armor, another slamming into the track guard with a hideous screech but failing to penetrate. Then Hoffman's attention fixed on one particular T-34. It had advanced further than the others, using a collapsed barn for cover before making a bold dash toward a hold-down position behind a low ridge. Aggressive tactics. Dangerous tactics, but effective. Target that T-34, the one by the ridge, Weber ordered. He's trying to flank us. Hoffman centered the crosshairs, compensating for range and the tank's movement. On target. Fire. The shell caught the T-34 on the turret side. A good hit. Through the smoke, Hoffman expected to see the Soviet tank explode or at least stop dead. Instead, it kept moving, disappearing behind the ridge. Hit confirmed, but he's still mobile. Hair loinant. Impossible, Weber muttered. You struck him clean. I saw it too, Dietrich added from his position by the breach. Should have cracked that turret open. But the T-34 hadn't died. Minutes later, it reappeared, this time at a different angle, and fired. The rounds screamed past their Panzer, missing by centimeters. Whoever commanded that Soviet tank knew exactly what they were doing. The battle raged on, but Hoffman found himself fixated on that particular T-34. They hit it twice more over the next hour, once on the turret again, once on the lower hull. Each time the tank seemed to shudder, seemed ready to brew up, but each time it kept fighting. It was as if the thing was cursed or blessed, protected by some malevolent guardian spirit. That tank has the devil's own luck, Muller said, giving voice to what they were all thinking. Finally, as afternoon shadows lengthened and ammunition ran low on both sides, the Soviet attack broke off. The T-34s withdrew into the forest, their engines growling defiance. The Germans held the crossroads, technically a victory, but 3 of their 7 tanks burned, and the survivors were down to a handful of shells each. That night, huddled around a small fire in a commandeered cellar, Hoffman's crew tried to process what they'd seen. The indestructible T-34 had become, in those few hours, a legend among the German defenders. Other crews reported similar experiences direct hits that should have killed the tank, yet it kept coming. Maybe it's one of those new models, Dietrich suggested, warming his hands over the flames. Thicker armor or something. We've faced new models, Weber said. This was different. The crew, whoever they are, they're either incredibly skilled or incredibly lucky. 2 days later, the answer came from an unexpected source. A reconnaissance patrol had captured a Soviet supply truck that had become separated from its unit. Among the prisoners was a young Ukrainian conscript who spoke broken German. During the interrogation by the battalion intelligence officer, the prisoner mentioned something that rippled through the German lines like electricity. The indestructible T-34 was real, and it was commanded by a mixed crew that included a black Soviet tanker. When Hoffman heard this, his first reaction was confusion, then disbelief, then a strange cognitive vertigo. A black soldier in a Soviet tank? The propaganda ministry had filled their heads with a carefully constructed racial hierarchy. The Slavs were bad enough, subhuman according to the official doctrine, but at least they were white, more or less. The presence of a black man commanding or crewing a Soviet tank didn't fit into any category. Hoffman's indoctrination had prepared him for. It's impossible, Dietrich said when they discussed it. The prisoner must be lying or confused, but Weber, who had been in the war longer than any of them, looked thoughtful. The Soviets have always claimed they don't care about race, he said carefully, just class. Worker solidarity, all that Bolshevik nonsense. If they truly believe it, ... single quotes, he trailed off, unwilling or unable to complete the thought. That night Hoffman lay awake in the cold darkness, unable to sleep. His mind kept returning to that T-34, to the skilled way it had maneuvered, to how it had absorbed punishment that should have destroyed it. And now, knowing, or at least suspecting, that one of the crew was black, everything became more complicated. He thought about his Hitler youth training, the racial lectures, the charts showing skull shapes and intelligence hierarchies. He thought about the casual certainty with which his instructors had explained that certain peoples were simply inferior, incapable of matching German martial prowess. And then he thought about that T-34 surviving 3 direct hits and still fighting effectively. Reality, it seemed, had failed to read the instruction manual. Inside the T-34 that had become the focus of so much German speculation, Sergeant Yakov Zakharov was dealing with his own complicated thoughts. The 31-year-old tank commander had been fighting since 1942, surviving the hell of Stalingrad and the vast armored clashes at Kursk. He had seen enough death to fill several lifetimes, and his face bore the scars to prove it, a burn mark along his jaw from when his first tank had been hit, and a puckered line across his forehead from shrapnel. But what occupied his mind now, as they performed maintenance on their battered T-34 in a forest clearing far behind the lines, wasn't his own wounds. It was the question of how to keep his crew alive long enough to see Berlin, and specifically how to keep one particular crew member safe. "Yakov, pass me that wrench," called Joseph Williams, currently half submerged in the tank's engine compartment, his dark brown hands black with grease. The American-accented Russian still sounded strange to Zakharov's ears, even after 6 months of serving together. Joseph Williams, or Iosif Viliamov as he appeared on Soviet military documents, was the reason their tank had survived that recent engagement. As the gunner, he had demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to place shots exactly where they needed to go. And more importantly, he had kept his nerve when German shells were landing all around them. The man could shoot, and he could think under pressure. That made him invaluable. But Joseph's presence in a Soviet tank crew was unusual enough to generate questions, rumors, and occasional problems that had nothing to do with combat effectiveness. Williams had been born in Detroit, Michigan, the son of an auto worker who had fled north during the Great Migration. His father, Marcus Williams, had been a union organizer and convinced socialist who corresponded with international labor movements. Young Joseph grew up attending meetings where men spoke passionately about worker solidarity and the only country where racial equality was supposedly guaranteed by law, the Soviet Union. When Marcus died in a factory accident that Joseph was convinced was no accident at all, and when Joseph himself faced trumped-up charges after a fight with a white supervisor, he made a decision that would define his life. In 1938, at age 21, he used his father's old connections to board a freighter bound for Leningrad. He wanted to see this worker's paradise for himself, and more practically, he wanted to escape a country where the color of his skin predetermined his possibilities. The reality of the Soviet Union had been more complicated than the pamphlet suggested. Yes, the official ideology proclaimed racial equality. Yes, there were African students in Moscow and Leningrad treated as honored guests and symbols of international solidarity. But Joseph quickly learned that being a symbol was different from being a person. People stared. Children pointed. Even well-meaning Soviets sometimes treated him like an exotic curiosity rather than a human being. Still, when Germany invaded in 1941, Joseph volunteered immediately. Partly from genuine ideological conviction, he hated fascism with a passion born from American experience, but partly because he knew that earning citizenship through blood was the only way he would ever be fully accepted. They assigned him to a tank unit, initially as a mechanic. His automotive knowledge from Detroit served him well. Then, after their gunner was killed during a German counterattack near Kharkov, Joseph had taken the man's position and discovered he had a gift for it. Now, in February 1945, he was part of Zakharov's crew, officially and accepted by most. The other crew members, loader Dmitry Petrov, driver Ivan Kolesnik, and Commander Zakharov himself, had long since stopped caring about his skin color. What mattered was that he could shoot straight and wouldn't panic when the shells started flying. But Joseph knew that not everyone shared his crewmates' pragmatism. He had overheard the whispers, seen the stares from other units. Some political officers viewed him with suspicion, wondering if he might be a spy or provocateur. Some soldiers, despite the official ideology, couldn't completely shake prejudices that ran deeper than communist doctrine. "We took some bad hits yesterday," Joseph said, emerging from the engine compartment and wiping his hands on a rag. He spoke Russian fluently now, though his accent remained distinctly foreign. "I'm surprised we made it back. Your shooting kept them off balance," Zakharov replied. "And Ivan's driving." He nodded toward Kolesnik, who was checking the tracks. "He knows how to position us to deflect shots." "Lucky," Dmitry added. The young loader, barely 19, had a persistent optimism that somehow hadn't been beaten out of him by the war. "We're lucky." "Luck runs out," Joseph said quietly. He had seen too many lucky crews turn into burning coffins. That evening, as they sat around brewing tea on a small camp stove, Zakharov brought up something that had been bothering him. "Joseph, you know there's talk about our tank. About you." Joseph looked up, his dark eyes meeting Zakharov's. "What kind of talk?" "The Germans. We captured a prisoner who said the fascists are asking questions. They know there's a black soldier in our crew." Zakharov paused, choosing his words carefully. "This could make things more dangerous for you if we get captured," Joseph finished. "I know, Yakov. I've always known." He set down his tea, staring into the flames. "If the Germans catch me, I'm dead. Probably tortured first, then dead. They'll want to make an example." The crew fell silent. It was the unspoken truth they all understood. For Zakharov, Dmitri, and Ivan, capture meant a prison camp, brutal, possibly fatal, but not certain death. For Joseph, capture meant something worse. "Then we make sure they don't catch you," Dmitri said with fierce certainty. "We make sure they don't catch any of us." Ivan nodded agreement. "We've come this far together. We finished together." Joseph felt something tighten in his chest, a mix of gratitude and sorrow. These men, Russian, Ukrainians, so different from him in background and experience, had become his brothers. They had accepted him not because of ideology or official doctrine, but because they had bled together, frozen together, and somehow survived together. "Thank you," he said simply, and meant it more deeply than the words could convey. The next morning brought new orders. Their battalion would attack again, pushing toward the same crossroads they had assaulted 2 days prior. The Germans had reinforced, but so had the Soviets. This time the Red Army would come with overwhelming force. As they prepared for battle, buttoning up the hatches and running final checks, Joseph felt the familiar pre-combat fear settling into his gut. He had learned to function through it, to let training and instinct take over, but the fear never really went away. He thought about his father, wondered what Marcus would think of his son now, a gunner in a Soviet tank, fighting fascists on the Eastern Front. He thought about Detroit, about the America he had left behind, wondered if it had changed at all. The attack began at dawn with a massive artillery barrage that turned the frozen landscape into a hellscape of fire and smoke. Then the tanks rolled forward, dozens of T-34s advancing in waves. The Germans fought back desperately, knowing they were outnumbered, knowing this was likely the beginning of the end. Zakharov's T-34, scarred but functional, took its position in the assault. Through his gun sight, Joseph could see German tanks maneuvering into defensive positions, their guns tracking across the battlefield. He identified a Panzer IV, probably the same one that had hit them repeatedly during the last engagement. "Target Panzer IV, range 700 meters, Joseph reported, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Engage at will," Zakharov commanded. Joseph centered the crosshairs, compensating for the T-34's movement in the wind. He fired. The shells screamed across the gap, striking the German tank on its turret front. Through the smoke, he saw the Panzer IV shudder but keep fighting. Tough vehicle, good armor. The battle descended into the familiar chaos of armored combat. Joseph fired again and again, methodically working through targets. Dmitri loaded with frantic efficiency. Ivan maneuvered the tank with precision born from countless engagements. Zakharov coordinated everything, his calm voice cutting through the noise. They took hits. One glanced off the turret. Another struck the track but failed to disable them. Each impact made Joseph flinch involuntarily, waiting for the moment when a shell would penetrate and turn their tank into a tomb. But that moment didn't come. They kept fighting, kept surviving. At one point, Joseph's gun sight locked onto the same Panzer for they had dueled with before. Through the magnification, he could see its commander in the cupola. Could almost imagine the man inside, young probably, scared definitely, fighting because he had no other choice, just like Joseph himself. For a fraction of a second, Joseph hesitated. Not from compassion exactly, but from the strange recognition that the man in that tank was a human being, not an abstract enemy. Then training reasserted itself. He adjusted his aim and fired. The shell struck the Panzer IV's side armor, punching through. Joseph saw flame erupt from the hatches. Crewmen bailed out, uniforms smoking. One man, the commander, perhaps stumbled a few steps before collapsing in the snow. Joseph felt nothing. Or rather, he felt too much and had learned to suppress it all. Another German tank destroyed, another small step toward Berlin, another day survived. The Soviets won the engagement, as they were increasingly winning everywhere along the front. The Germans retreated, abandoning the crossroads and falling back to the next defensive line. Zakharov's crew secured their position and began the grim work of salvaging what they could from the battlefield. That evening, Soviet military intelligence brought something unusual to battalion headquarters. A German prisoner who insisted on speaking specifically about the T-34 crew that included a black soldier. The man was Obergifferter Klaus Hoffmann, burned and in shock but alive. Joseph was brought to meet him along with Zakharov. It was an irregular request, but the political officers saw propaganda value in it. Here was a German who had faced the racially inferior Soviets and lost, confronted with the reality of a black man who had outfought him. Hoffmann sat on a bench in a requisitioned farmhouse, his burns bandaged, his eyes haunted. When Joseph entered, followed by Zakharov, the German's eyes widened with something Joseph couldn't quite identify: surprise. Yes, but also confusion and perhaps a flicker of grudging respect. They brought in a translator, a Red Army lieutenant who spoke German. Zakharov gestured for Joseph to sit across from Hoffman. Ask him if he remembers our tanks, Zakharov said. The translator conveyed the question. Hoffman nodded slowly. Ja, he said, then continued in German while the translator interpreted. We hit your tank 3 times, maybe 4. You should be dead. Joseph leaned forward. Good armor. Good crew. Good luck. We were told ... single quotes Hoffman started, then stopped. Through the translator, he tried again. They told us the Soviets were inferior, that Slavs couldn't match German soldiers. He looked directly at Joseph. They told us black men were even less capable, barely human. Joseph met his gaze steadily. And now you know different. Now I know nothing, Hoffman said, and there was something broken in his voice. I know my crew is dead. I know we lost. I know everything I was taught was ... single quotes he trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. The silence stretched between them, 2 soldiers from opposite sides of an ideological and literal war, both shaped and damaged by it in ways they were only beginning to understand. Finally, Joseph spoke, and the translator conveyed his words. I'm from America, from Detroit. I came here because they told me the Soviet Union was different, that race didn't matter, only the worker struggle. He paused. It's more complicated than that. It's always more complicated. But when the fascists came, when your army invaded, I chose to fight. Not because some theory told me to, but because I knew what fascism means for people who look like me. Single quotes Hoffman absorbed this, his worldview clearly shattered and reforming in ways he couldn't yet articulate. I was 19 when the war started, he said quietly. We believed everything they told us. Everything. And now, ... now you live, Joseph said. You survive. And maybe you remember that the men you fought were just men. Some of us darker, some lighter, some speaking different languages. But all just men, trying to live. It wasn't forgiveness. Joseph wasn't sure he could forgive what the Wehrmacht had done across the Soviet Union. It wasn't even understanding, not really. But it was perhaps the beginning of recognition, a small crack in the edifice of hate that the war had been built upon. The interview ended shortly after. Hoffman was taken to a prisoner transport, beginning his journey to a Soviet POW camp. Joseph returned to his crew, to his tank, to the endless grinding advance toward Berlin. That night, lying in his bedroll beneath the T-34, Joseph stared up at the stars visible through bare tree branches. He thought about Detroit, about the Soviet Union, about all the complicated reasons he had ended up here in a tank on the Eastern Front. He thought about Hoffman, about the shock in the Germans' eyes when propaganda met reality and shattered. Tomorrow they would fight again. More Germans would die, more Soviets too. The war would grind forward with mechanical inevitability. But perhaps in that brief moment when 2 enemies sat across from each other and saw each other as human beings, something had shifted. Some small recognition that the categories they had been taught, superior and inferior, human and subhuman, were lies that served only to perpetuate the killing. Joseph closed his eyes, seeking what sleep he could find. The war continued, vast and terrible, but individual moments of recognition accumulated like snowflakes, each one tiny but together perhaps substantial enough to matter. He would fight tomorrow and the day after and the day after that until Berlin fell or he died trying. But tonight he allowed himself to believe that his survival, his presence, his refusal to fit into any category the fascists had prepared for him, meant something beyond tactics and strategy. He was Joseph Williams, a black American in a Soviet tank, who had shocked a German Panzer crew simply by refusing to die. In the vast machinery of total war, it was a small story. But sometimes small stories contained truths larger than grand narratives could hold. And sometimes surviving, continuing to fight, continuing to exist when the ideology demanded your erasure, was itself a form of victory. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human conflict. But below them, men continued to make choices about who they would be and what they would fight for. And in those choices perhaps lay the only redemption the war would offer.